I was meant to be at work on Wall Street and would have been coming out of the Fulton Street station right by the WTC when the first plane hit. However, I took my mother to NYC for a surprise, first trip there since 1968. We live in New Zealand, so I had a week off work to spend with her. We flew in on September 9th, 2001. On the morning of the 10th, I said, "What do you want to do first?" She said, "When I was last here, the Twin Towers were being built, and I thought when I left that I'd love to go up to the top when they're finished. So I'd like to do that." That's how I found myself standing on the observation deck of one of the Twin Towers at around 3 p.m. on September 10th, 2001. The next morning, I looked out my window. We were staying a 10-minute walk from the WTC and saw that the towers were on fire. I genuinely thought I was dreaming and tried to wake myself up. Okay, I'll try not to make it too long. My office was on the north side, so I sat with my right shoulder facing the window. The plane came in right over my head. I didn't see it. I stood up and went to the window. A couple of points. One, the windows were floor to ceiling, and two, the towers were built to sway in the wind. As I went to the window, the force of the impact had made the tower sway one way, so it started to sway back, and I felt like I was going towards the window. I stepped back, and then a few seconds later, a ton of debris started falling. I ran out of my office into the cube farm and saw all these faces with massive wide eyes staring at me over the cubicle walls. I shouted for everybody to evacuate. We hit the stairwell and made the first 3 floors in just a few seconds. I think we nearly jumped entire flights, it felt that fast. Then came to a screaming halt as the stairwells filled. Another side note, emergency stairwells are not big enough. And one more side note, my boss's boss did a walk around our floor to make sure everybody was out. The man has balls of steel and will forever have my utmost respect. So I stopped in the stairwell and started to think. I had one of those newfangled BlackBerries that you could send texts and emails on. I hit up my guys on the trading floor in the World Financial Center. "We've had an explosion. Look out the window and tell me if I should go up or down." They could see the towers. He told me, "Plane hit above you. Go down." Emailed my wife in Midtown to tell her I was okay and evacuating. We swapped some emails as she was watching the TV in her office. So the slow descent started. We ended up single file against the wall as the firefighters came up the inside of the stairwell. I'm guessing they didn't make it out. Saw some burns victims come down. Won't get graphic, but it was not nice. Got another text a little while later from my guys at WorldFi. "Second tower's been hit. Get the fuck out now." I showed it to my colleague and we agreed that we had to keep it quiet to avoid mass panic. Eventually got to the bottom. 6 inches of water all over. The elevators looked like sheets of aluminum foil that had been punched. I think the fuel from the plane exploded down the elevator shafts. Got to an exit and there was an overhang. There was a cop bobbing out and in. He got you ready and told me to put my arms over my head for protection from falling stuff. He waited for a break and shouted, "Run!" I sprinted across the street and then stopped to turn around and see just what was going on. Walked several blocks north and east, I think, and believe it or not, found a bus going north. I guess the man upstairs was on my side that day. Ended up in Midtown at my wife's office watching the day unfold. Late in the day, we walked to the Hudson River and got a ferry across to Weehawken. We lived in Hoboken at the time, so we walked home from there. Finally went back to ground zero for the first time 2 years ago. My kids are all old enough to understand. It was much harder than I thought it was going to be, if I'm honest.
Was halfway down the stairwell when the building shook. Didn't know what it was, so continued to go all the way down. I stupidly did not exit on the concourse level, but the street level. I could have easily been killed from falling concrete or bodies. I saw some unpleasant things, but was not exposed to it for days, weeks, or years, so don't think it had an LT effect on me. Didn't hang around and left the area before either tower collapsed. So all my decisions and actions saved me that day, miraculously.
Truly. I was driving to meet friends for coffee and heard about the first plane on the radio. I assumed it was a little 2-4-seater. Got to the coffee shop and everyone was there except Julie. She was at the barber shop across the lane watching the TV. She came over with wild panic in her eyes, tears pouring down her face. Her husband had a breakfast meeting on the top of Tower 1 at 8:30 a.m. He was an antitrust lawyer in the middle of a big case. She didn't have a cell phone, so I gave her mine. His just went to voicemail. She was shaking from head to toe, couldn't reach her husband. She called his office, and no one who was on the NY Keem had checked in yet. Then Tower 1 fell. I never ever want to witness a person in the state she was in. I can't begin to describe the terror she was living. It was a palpable, fierce, raw emotion that consumed her entire being. I held her toddler in my arms, who sat silently with eyes the size of oranges, watching his mother devolve into this electric pain. I said she should call home because if he was okay, maybe he would call her there. She called. Suddenly it was like all her bones turned to rubber and she fell into the chair behind her. He left her a message. He's okay. His team was late. The first plane hit as they were walking into the building. Then, we all are together. I lost my shoe and my cell phone. I'm using Kathy's cell. Then, we have to get out of here. There's chunks of plane falling. Oh God, there's bodies falling. I have to move or I will get hit. Then she didn't hear from him for 4 hours. 6 months later, me and her were shopping at the mall, buying her husband a passport wallet, etc. She stopped and grabbed my arm and said, "I am buying stuff to replace things my husband lost in a terrorist attack. This is so surreal." It was, still is.
I was in my first year of high school, Australia. It was about 3 a.m. and I could hear the TV on. Odd, as my family had all gone to bed many hours previously and TV wasn't allowed before school. I stumbled out to the lounge room to find my father standing rod straight, eyes glued to the screen. He didn't look at me, just lifted his arm in a gesture to get me to his side. We stood there together in horror as the news broadcast the second tower falling. It was absolutely surreal. I feel that same sense of disconnection from reality every day now, watching the news from the States. My heart's still with you all.
Was still on university holidays at the time between my second and third year. Had a typical lazy holiday morning, got out of bed at about midday, had some lunch and watched Neighbours. Was about to go and do something when the daytime TV schedule was interrupted by a BBC News bulletin saying both towers of the WTC were on fire. From that point on, I watched it unfold on TV. When reports came in of the third plane hitting the Pentagon, I thought WW3 was about to kick off. It was clear this was not an accident. Watched the towers collapse live. I texted my brother, who was at college, to tell him both WTC towers had been destroyed by planes hitting them, and he didn't believe me. We went to the local pub that evening for a drink, and everyone in there was just talking about it to each other in disbelief. I'll never forget that day. People often talk about remembering exactly where they were when they heard JFK was shot. 9/11 is a similar kind of event in my life.
Freshman year of college, in the common room of my dorm floor. Only the second person awake, just after my roommate, who woke me up saying, "A plane just hit the World Trade Center." Frantically calling my mom, a flight attendant who was in the air at the time, over and over, trying to get through to her phone. Calling her flight attendant friends, my brother, anyone who might know what her flight plan that day was. She got through to me about 2 hours later. They grounded her flight at the closest airport, Raleigh, and kept them on board for a bit before letting them off. She was in a car with a stranger who heard her talking to my brother, who was telling her that I was panicked and trying to get a hold of her. He asked where she needed to go, and she told him where I was, Syracuse. He happened to be driving to Boston and offered to drive her. In a move she would never, ever do on a normal day, she got in a car with a complete stranger who drove her hours out of his way to get her back to me. We stayed close friends with that man and talked to him often, meeting up with him any time we happened to be in each other's vicinity. He passed away this past summer. It was the first time in 23 years we didn't speak to each other on that day. Felt weird. I'll be forever thankful for him on that day. I needed her.
I was on the train heading into NYC. The first plane hit right as my train was pulling in to pick us up. A friend's dad called her and told her not to get on the train, but I was already on with another friend, so we missed getting off. I found out what was happening with a call to a friend who I knew was home with her kids. The second plane hit when we were on the phone. I could have gotten off in Newark, but for some reason I didn't. I made it into Penn Station, heard a police officer say, "The next train out is the last train out." I jumped on it and saw the towers fall as we were pulling out of the tunnel back on the NJ side.
Working security in a courthouse minutes away. I was brushing my teeth when I felt first plane fly over. It flew low enough to be felt in my building. Radio call of fire, fire went out seconds later. Replies of location weren't answered. I ran downstairs to exit the building when I saw damaged tower. That began one of the longest days of my life. I was working night shift. I woke around 11 a.m., started moving around the house. I had a radio in the bathroom on a plug connected to the light switch, so it came on automatically with the light. I went in to shave, so I had the light on, and my favorite music was replaced by the middle of a news bulletin. I had to listen for a few minutes to understand what was even going on. When I finally heard enough to comprehend what was happening, I went into the living room and stayed glued to the TV all day until time to leave for work. I was in my early 40s at the time. I was on a business trip for a meeting halfway across the country from my home. We went into crisis mode because where I worked was an organization that would be involved in emergencies at the national level. Fortunately, we had most of the people together in one location, which allowed us to work effectively without the modern web meeting tools today. As soon as I heard that all the flights were grounded, I called the rental car and told them that I was changing my drop-off location to back home. The woman couldn't understand why I would want to return it thousands of miles away, but I knew how it was going to play out. After the meeting, I drove back halfway across the country, dropping colleagues off at their homes along the way. Meanwhile, we spend the time in the car having meeting calls with the one phone that had a speaker function sitting on the console.
On an express bus on the way to work, down Queens Boulevard, regular morning. On the highway to the tunnel, we saw the first building smoking and someone on the bus said a plane had crashed into the building. Coming out of the tunnel in the East 30s, the city was in mayhem because the second plane had hit by then. Ended up walking home. It was a blue sky, mild Tuesday, and I went to the local bar for a few hours when I got back to my neighborhood.
In the Middle East, I'm Persian, and my family went on our first and only trip to Iran. I was watching a show in my grandma's TV room, and she came running in while on the phone and took the remote from me and changed the channel. At first, I thought it was a movie she put on. We got stuck there for months because of 9/11. What was supposed to be a summer trip ended up with me having to get a tutor there so I wasn't behind on schoolwork, and it took so much for my dad to get us return flights home. Came home to a different America than when we left. Security was so intense at the airports, and I just remember the extreme patriotism all over the place. Even my old Persian grandpa had an American flag on his car when he picked us up from the airport. That wasn't there before. Crazy times. This is from a teenager's perspective and experience. I was 15, I had stayed up all night not doing my schoolwork, complicated situation, was homeschooled in the loosest of terms, and watching anime. My young siblings had woken up, and I came out to watch them while my mother slept. We had been watching kids' shows on PBS, but something annoying came on, and I switched to the news for a while. The Today Show was on. We all watched it from the beginning when they cut in about a small plane hitting the WTC. There was confusion and concern, of course, but it was just like any news story. It was probably a very unfortunate accident, right? And then the second plane hit. We all watched until the second tower fell when my mom finally got up and shut the television off and yelled at me for letting the kids watch that. I moved to my bedroom and was glued to the television for the next 48 hours. No sleep. We lived on a flight path, and the silence from the shutdown of all flights was so strange. When I finally did sleep, I dreamed of being trapped in the stairwells over and over. It was probably my age, showing naivety, but up until that point, the world I lived in was relatively safe. It was my home life that was dangerous. Yes, bad things happened, but not like this. Not in America. It shook me to the core. There was a huge swell in patriotism, but it also ignited anti-Muslim sentiment across the country that also affected people like Sikhs and Hindus, because people whipped up into their frenzies couldn't tell the difference. It was a scary time. Then the war on terror started. Iraq and Afghanistan sent my generation to fight. I got recruitment calls weekly until I told them I was gay and would not hide who I was to die for a county that didn't respect me. They stopped calling after that. It was a traumatic day that set in motion many terrible things. Yes, good things did come of it, like removing Saddam from power. But was that really our responsibility? And now seeing the end of the Afghan occupation, it's hard to think about those who lost their lives or limbs and who suffer from PTSD from their time there. It really does seem like it was all for absolutely nothing. The women are just as oppressed as ever. The Taliban is still in power. We abandoned many who were allies to us. What did we even achieve? Hundreds of thousands dead between Iraq and Afghanistan, all for the actions of a few on one day in September. It's a tough thing to think about and difficult to come to a conclusion if in the end it was even worth it.
3rd grade. West Coast, so all the plane crashes had already happened by the time I woke up. I remember going downstairs for breakfast, and my mom was talking to her sister on the phone in a panicked voice, talking about how this is one of those days that will go down in history. School that day was weird. My teacher was pretty obviously checked out and distraught, so she had us write a letter to our future selves about that day and how it made us feel. We spent the rest of the day playing board games, so that was cool at least. I remember going home that night and flipping through channels and seeing that a lot of them had ended their broadcast for the day out of respect for the victims. I was upset that the usual back-to-back Simpsons and King of the Hill slot on Q13 Fox in Seattle had been preempted for news coverage. I played Crash Team Racing instead. To see through the eyes of a child.
I was 10 years old, so 5th grade, I think. My dad was in NYC that week for work. He decided to fly home early that morning, but his best friend / family friend / coworker was still in NYC en route to a meeting at the WTC. So I was freaking out in school. My mom came to pick me up. It was very stressful until we got a hold of my dad and his friend. I live right near an Air Force base. The noise of the planes and jets 24/7 was insane. They never fly at night, but during that time, they did. I remember laying in bed in the dark and crying because I thought every plane had a bomb for us. I remember sitting in the cafeteria at school shortly after, and the coach, who we all thought walked on water, lol, casually said, "Oh yeah, looks like we are going to have World War III." I was horrified and really scared after he said that, because if Coach said it, it's definitely true. Then a year or so later, I got to watch USA bomb the absolute shit out of Baghdad on TV live in the middle of keyboarding class. Good Lord. I'm 33 now, and 9/11 is still a really sore subject for me. I can't watch the documentaries, specials, videos, interviews, none of it. Pure terror.
I was 24 at the time and spent the summer traveling around Europe. On September 11th, I was on a flight from Frankfurt, Germany to Toronto, Canada, while the attacks happened. Instead of landing in Toronto to catch my next flight to Minneapolis, my flight was diverted to Montreal. The flight crew didn't tell us why we were diverted or what happened, so I assumed maybe there was an aircraft incident at the Toronto airport. The airport in Montreal was empty, except for people grabbing their bags. I think it was a news crew that finally told me what happened as people were grabbing their bags, but they said it was 7 aircraft that had crashed into buildings throughout the U.S., and she didn't say any locations. I thought we were going to war, and I'll probably be recalled to active duty soon. While in the baggage area, we were told to come back the next day to catch another flight home, so I took a taxi to a hotel and watched news clips of the attacks happen on TV. I went back to the airport the next morning and was told the U.S. airspace was closed, but was told to wait around in case there's something changes. After a couple of days of waiting at the airport, I was able to get a flight to Toronto on September 14th, but I wasn't able to get to Minneapolis, so I called my mom and dad and asked if they can pick me up in Thunder Bay, Canada. Finally, I flew from Toronto to Thunder Bay, just north of the Minnesota border, while they drove the 6 hours north to pick me up. If you haven't seen it yet, there's a great documentary, You Are Here, a come-from-away story, when 9/11 forced 38 planes to land in Gander, Newfoundland. Locals welcomed 6,500-plus stranded passengers for 5 days.
I was woken by a phone call between 5:45 and 6 a.m. It was my stepdad, who worked at a government site in Oregon that held chemical weapons, telling me that a plane had hit a building in NY, to turn on the television, and that he likely would not be home tonight because the site was on lockdown. I turned on the TV in my room just minutes before the second plane hit. I woke up my older stepsister and told her to turn on her TV and called a few friends to tell them what was happening. I watched all morning from my bed, sometimes falling asleep for a few moments only to wake up to new and terrible things happening on the television. I watched the last moments of many fallers live on TV. I was numb through it all. This was an unimaginable event. I instantly knew it was my generation's version of the "where were you when Kennedy was shot" moment. I also couldn't quite take it all in. I wasn't capable of a rational emotional reaction. I was 18, had just graduated high school, and was starting community college in a few weeks. More importantly, my mother had died just 8 days before, and her funeral had taken place 2 days before on the 9th. She had died due to a terminal illness she was diagnosed with when I was 15, so things had been topsy-turvy for a while, and for me, the world had already ended just a few days before 9/11. Now, from across the country in Washington state, I watched the towers fall live on TV, having seen real, living people tumble out of them, alone in my bed, completely empty, completely unafraid, feeling nothing and being aware of that fact. At 18, my brain wasn't completely developed, was still taking in core memories and moments to carve neural pathways that would last a lifetime. It knew it needed to just turn off. This thing that was happening to my people, to my country, to my timeline, to my world, was just too big for one 18-year-old girl. So my brain observed, but would not allow me to personalize any of it. Years and years later, that would change, of course, but in those first moments, if I had been able to feel anything, I would have crumbled along with those towers.
I'd been out of school for a couple years and was working at a client's office in downtown Atlanta. Someone had a radio on and started laughing and saying some moron just crashed their plane into one of the towers. We thought it was like a private plane at first. Then more reports started coming in and we realized it was a commercial jet. Everyone got more somber, but we still thought it was an accident. We gathered in a break room that had a TV. Then the second plane hit. Then the news about the Pentagon. Office building was evacuated and we all got out of the downtown area. At the time, we didn't know if more attacks were coming. After that, I was trying to make sure my friends from school, 4 or 5 of which worked in one of the towers or surrounding complex, were okay. Until that, the most surreal event I experienced was the Challenger accident that happened when I was in 2nd grade or thereabouts.
I was a sophomore in high school. I heard something on the radio getting ready about some idiot pilot hitting the World Trade Center. When I got to school, the second plane had hit, and the realization of what was happening dawned on me. That far broke the world. I wish kids today could have experienced what the world felt like before that day, at least for white, middle-class people like myself. The world was good. We were going to usher in a new age of democracy and peace. The EU was going to end war in Europe.
The Soviets had lost. The good guys had won. It's only gotten worse since. Looking back, the fall of our country really began with Reagan, but I'm not sure we would have become this radical without 9/11 making Americans scared again. Bin Laden's goal was to break us, and in a way he failed, but in a more profound way he didn't. Our paranoia exacerbated our divisions, and we broke ourselves. We started laying the groundwork for a militarized police force and the surveillance of the American people. Cheney began to set up his parallel government, which laid the groundwork for a runaway executive branch. The neocons got the justification they needed to start invading the Middle East, getting us mired in decades of war. America's optimism died that day, I think.
I was what they called a third key supervisor at a Sam Goody store in a mall, having just graduated high school a few months prior. There was a football merch store across the hall that had a television. None of the stores were open yet, so I was curious why so many people were gathering in front of their TV. Then I got a call from my regional manager about the WTC getting hit. They made me wait about another hour before telling me we weren't opening. My dad picked me up at the mall around 11 a.m. While waiting, I met a woman that had escaped the Pentagon, hitched a ride, and got dropped about halfway home at the mall. I made my dad take her home. He was so uncomfortable, but saw I was super serious. I'm glad he left his comfort zone to get her home. I went home, cried, had dinner with my family. Looking to my sister for emotional support, she mocked me that my favorite building in NY were gone. And 2 guy friends from high school knocked on my door during dinner. I chastised them for trying to socialize during this time, and they gave me shit for not being more understanding. 'Twas a day full of emotions.
This will probably get buried. I was in 11th grade in the Midwest, and I was attending a charter school. It was a new concept, so the school was in an old grocery store, and the classrooms were separated by 6-foot-tall separators. This is important. Minding my own business at my desk, when someone comes into the school and yells as loud as they can, "America is under attack." My initial reaction was, yeah, right, okay. Shortly after, I heard a teacher start uncontrollably sobbing, which got the whole building standing and looking. Her brother worked on one of the floors of the 2 towers. They wheeled out one of the televisions in the cafeteria area, and as they turned on the television, we saw the second airplane hit the second tower. We watched in horror as people began jumping from windows on live television and listened on as teachers tried to contact family to ensure they are safe. I have a friend whose mother was killed in the attack. She was on one of the top floors of the first building that was hit.
Started the day finishing putting a Corvette back together. Heard the first plane hit on Howard Stern. Had to test drive the car for 200 miles to seat the new piston rings, so I drove her to Jersey City. Saw the second plane hit in person. Stuck around until the towers collapsed. The police came by to clear the highway for emergency vehicles. I got back to my shop. We closed up and I went right to my volunteer firefighter company. The truck's already left, so I was helping get medical and cleaning supplies. On 9/14, I went to do some SAR in our truck. I still see what I saw sometimes when I close my eyes. Lost 5 friends that day. A few years later, I was an ironworker foreman on the rebuilding project. We found some more remains while digging around the survivor stairs. Survivors and family members came to the site every day. I heard so many stories. I finished the memorial and did the last 10 floors of Tower 1. It was an experience that lives with me forever. Not just what I saw or heard, but I also got lung disease from being there so long. I was in a meeting at a client in West London. Our office was at Canary Wharf. All through that meeting, I could feel my phone going off time after time. It was only when the meeting ended did I look at it and see I had like 20 calls from 10, 15 people. Called the office and they were telling me they were being evacuated. I made it down to reception and saw people huddled round a TV. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Even stranger, I then got a train and went to Reading versus West Ham United. Looking back, I can't believe the game actually went ahead. No one cared. We all thought WW3 was beginning. It was a surreal evening, that's for sure. My team lost that game. Couldn't have cared less. I'm Canadian, and I was 8 years old. I remember it being a relatively ordinary day. No talk of it at school. To the students, at least. I'm sure the teachers were talking. After school, I was picked up by a friend of my mom's and went to her house until my sister, who was 16 at the time, walked home from HS and picked me up. On the short walk home from there, my sister told me. The only thing I remember is her saying, "Something really bad happened today." I'm sure she told me about it, but that's quite literally all I remember. It's funny because my mom was a Sam, so it was extremely unusual that she hadn't picked me up from school. She must have had an appointment or other commitment that day. So what I remember is it was a day that was a bit out of my ordinary routine, and my sister's very first words about it.
Also, 4th grade. I remember handing birthday cupcakes to my class, since 9/11 is also my birthday. Then everyone started leaving one by one, since their parents were picking them up from school. Thought it was because of me.